but at least it became an influence in the affairs of men and the excuse for setting up a new power which dominated men based upon an appeal to the teachings of Christ. And we have then the beginning of a new symbol. This symbol is likened to a beast, and we find it mentioned in the 13th chapter of Revelation. And since this is also mentioned in the three unclean spirits that we've been considering, we must find ourselves obliged to mention it also. In the first verse of the 13th chapter of Revelation we read, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him his power, and his seat, and great authority." Here we have the changeover of the ruling authority in a great empire which existed upon this earth. For hundreds of years it had been pagan in its thinking, uninfluenced by the teachings of God. A change comes about, brought about by war in its ruling authority. The then ruling emperor imposing new views upon the empire, and the dragon gave up its power, was forced to give it up, and transferred its power to a new symbol which represented the same empire, but now under the domination still of the thinking of man, but influenced by the profession of an apostate belief in the principles of the Lord Jesus Christ. You see the two influences. Now, the dragon was not destroyed. I think it's important to note that. As a matter of fact, the dragon went off into the wilderness to pursue the woman, symbolic of the followers of Jesus Christ, who had given birth to this man-child, Michael, who precipitated the war in heaven, which resulted in the dragon being cast out. The dragon continued to be in existence. And when you stop and reflect, there have always, from that day to this, been on the face of the earth some powers, some men who have brought into being a culture, a society, which has been based solely upon the thinkings of their own minds, uninfluenced by the teachings of God. This power was to continue for a considerable period of time and was to be still in existence in the last days. Not necessarily the same Roman power, but one which derived from it in similarity, if not in blood descent. It was also to be in existence with the power which had supplanted it, namely the beast power, which was a political configuration which we might, for shortness of time, point out as being the Holy Roman power or its descendant nations. We find this power was presided over by a strong influence. This influence has been brought out to us in the 17th chapter of Revelation as depicted, and it's been mentioned several times in the course of our addresses here, and I shan't go into details with it. It is mentioned as the same beast we just read about, same description of the beast, but pictured as having a woman, an evil woman, a meretricious woman, riding upon it and controlling it. And this is a symbol of the power which came out of the old Roman Empire, came into the new Holy Roman Empire, and which was dominated and presided over and controlled by the papacy. And as the saints of the Most High are likened in the symbolology of Revelation to a bride adorned for her husband, a woman of good character who has preserved herself faithful to the man she is to be betrothed to. So likewise those who have betrayed the truth and who have submitted to the teachings of mankind and tried to incorporate the two together, she is likened to an unfaithful woman, a woman who has prostituted herself to that which is evil and therefore has lost her right to be called the bride of Christ. So these nations then, and we might call them the nations of continental Europe, represented by a beast, no longer a dragon, but a beast, were dominated by a woman similar to the bride of Christ, but unfaithful and therefore unworthy to be called the bride of Christ. This series of nations, then, was to be in existence at the time that our sixth vial was poured out. And we find they were. And also to be in existence was to be this same dragon influence in the earth. Was this in existence? I think you will concede that it was. The same world war which brought a final termination to the Euphratian power and left it battered and helpless and dried up, also brought into evidence, as a result of the political upheavals of the time, a rising new power upon the map of Europe and of Asia. In order to attain its ascendancy, this power overthrew the Tsar of Russia and his royal family. They took control of the nation of Russia, and they proceeded to make of it a political experiment based upon the fleshly thinkings of a German philosopher. The Marxian communist theory which was imposed upon these people became the theory upon which they lived. It was unaffected in any way by the teachings of God, whom they profaned and refused to even recognize. They did not recognize any of the principles of the teachings of Jesus Christ. And in general, the whole civilization, society, and culture which has been built up in the Soviet Union today most precisely fits the kind of a culture which was existent in the Roman Empire in the days when the apostles went out to begin to preach the truth. A culture which is based solely and entirely upon the fleshly thinking of men's minds, which thing is adverse to the thinking of God and which may therefore be called the devil and Satan in its outlook. And it has risen to the point of great power in the world today. The spirits then, which were to come forth from this dragon, this beast, and this false prophet, would be the influences which would bring about a configuration of nations in the last time at or about at the time of the return of Christ, which would dominate the scene of world endeavor. Other nations, by means of a series of vials, had to be subdued or suppressed or dried up in order to make way for this new configuration of nations which was to arise. All three phases of this thing are evil in the sight of God, but in different ways. The dragon influence was evil in the sight of God because it lacked any knowledge of God. The beastly influence, dominated by the false prophet as it is spoken of here, which might be considered as another name for the woman who rides upon the beast and professes herself to be the vicar of God on earth. These influences are evil in the sight of God, perhaps even more so than the dragonic ones, because they profess to be of God while denying the principles and the teachings of God. And this is most obnoxious of all. So we come then to a series of things which we would like to go into in respect to this three unclean spirit like frog matter, which will lay the stage for the next great episode which is to take place. Have these spirits all done their work? We need to consider this question for a moment. Well, certainly if the dragon spirit is exemplified in what communism has done, I would say they have done their work pretty well. But what of the beast? What of the false prophet? The beast, as you know, was a united kingdom brought together by the power of the Roman authority, the papal authority, and forged into a single political unit in the days of the Emperor Constantine. No such thing as this exists on the earth today. You have perhaps been noting that brethren are quite interested in the European common market.